Pakistan, Dhaka International Airport. December 19, 1970. 9 hours and 20 minutes local time. A Soviet Antonov-22 heavy transport plane taxis to the runway and prepares for takeoff. A few hours ago, the giant had delivered humanitarian aid to the flood-stricken people of Pakistan and is now returning home. At 9:30 it takes off from Dhaka Airport. The plane is flown by an experienced military pilot First Class, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Skok. There are 11 crew members and 6 passengers on board. At 10:08, the National Civil Aviation Authority of India detects a change of course of the Soviet plane. The plane does not respond to air traffic controllers and continues to descend. In the 50th minute of the flight, the plane approaches the runway at Panagar Airfield in India for an emergency landing. The dispatcher watches as the huge plane, with its left wing smoking and one engine running, makes a runway approach. At about 3,000 feet, the only working engine stops and the plane calmly comes in for a landing with its engines not working. According to witnesses, there were no propellers on the second engine. The airplane in flight configuration at twice its normal landing speed, flies low over the runway with an upward roll and hits the ground with the wingtip, causing the airplane to collapse and disintegrate. After hitting the ground, the plane caught fire. Crew members and 6 passengers are killed. Antonov-22, the world's first widebody and the largest for its time transport aircraft. It was serially produced at the Tashkent Aviation Plant from 1966 to 1976. 68 aircraft in total were produced. At the 26th International Air Show in Le Bourget, the Soviet Union was proud to demonstrate the AN-22, where it became a world sensation. In the same 65, the AN-22 set 41 world records. And today the AN-22 is the biggest turboprop aircraft in the world. The maximal mass of this giant is 225, and its payload is 60 tons. The cargo cabin was 15 feet high, 90 feet long and 13 feet wide, which allowed it to carry absolutely all kinds of weapons and equipment of the time. The dimensions of this gigantic plane were impressive. The wingspan was 211 feet. The length was 190. The titanium floor of the cargo cabin could support the weight of any Soviet tank and could hold 3 armored personnel carriers or 300 soldiers. The plane was also widely used in the national economy. The first 5 years of AN-22 operation were accident-free. AN-22 carried cargo and equipment, was considered reliable and did not cause any problems. The machine flew successfully, landed on difficult airfields and worked out everything what military required from it. The Antonov-22 carried cargo and equipment and was considered to be reliable and trouble-free. However, beginning in 1970, the plane began to crash regularly. This was followed by a series of strange crashes, the causes of which have not yet been established. The first plane crash occurred on July 18, 1970. At the time, the Soviet Union was providing humanitarian aid to the earthquake-stricken population of Peru. The 81st Regiment of Military Transport Aviation was on a mission to deliver medical supplies and equipment using AN-22s. From 16 to 18 of July 5 AN-22s had to depart to Peru from the military airfield Chkalovsky near Moscow. The order of flights was as follows. On the first day, July 16th, 1 aircraft flew out. On July 17th, 2 more planes took off with an hour's interval. And on July 18, the last pair. For the aircraft with flight number 09303, this would have been the last flight to South America. Two routes were chosen for the flight to Peru, a northern and a southern one. Northern, Moscow-Chkalovsky, Reykjavik Eastland, Halifax Canada, Havana Cuba, Lima Peru. The length of this route was almost 10,500 miles, of which two-thirds of the route was over the ocean at a great distance from the coastline. The southern route, Moscow-Chkalovsky, Algeria, Guinea-Conakry, Belém Brazil, and Lima Peru. The southern route was shorter than the northern route by almost 1,800 miles and was considered preferable and safe because the flight was mostly over land. But a few days before departure, Brazil refused to accept our planes for a technical landing on its territory, and the flight took the northern route. The Soviet military aircraft were to fly over the territory of a potential adversary, Canada and the United States, so in order to maintain secrecy, the AN-22s were painted in the colors of the civilian airline Aeroflot. The crew members were also dressed in civil aviation pilots' uniforms. This photograph of the pilots was taken at the airfield a few hours before departure. On July 18, 1970 at 9 a.m. Moscow time, aircraft Antonov-22, number 09303, with medical equipment and a helicopter on board, took off from the Chkalovsky airfield near Moscow and headed for Reykjavik. There was a crew of 2, including ground service technicians, and 7 passengers on board, an interpreter and field hospital personnel. The total number of passengers was 22. The whole truth about chemtrails. Why do they poison us from airplanes every day? Satanists against humanity.
I have personally observed that this is not an inversion trace from an airplane.
Chemtrails myth or reality? What is the basis of evidence? Overpopulation leads to global humanitarian catastrophe. Watch this video on Author's Viewpoint channel and you'll be able to make your own conclusions about chemtrails. The aircraft, tail number 09303, was brand new, manufactured in 1969. In the 5 years of operation of this type of aircraft there had not been a single serious flight accident and nothing foretold trouble. After a 5.5-hour flight, the Antonov-22, piloted by experienced first-class military pilots, made a technical landing at Keflavik Airfield in Reykjavik. After refueling and inspecting the vehicle, the crew set a course for Halifax, Canada. 47 minutes after takeoff, after flying about 250 miles, the plane disappeared from radar. The dispatcher in Keflavik saw a flash on the monitor, after which the plane disappeared from radar. No radio reports of an accident were received from the crew. The crew did not come on the air in the next communication session. None of the aerodromes of the route, the said aircraft arrived. Then it became clear that a tragedy occurred over the waters of the Atlantic. 22 people on board were killed. In the USSR, it was customary to keep quiet about major accidents and disasters, which immediately sparked rumors of the disappearance of the plane near the Bermuda Islands, near where the route of the Soviet planes passed. But soon the world press started talking about the crash, which confirmed that the tragedy occurred in the North Atlantic between Iceland and Greenland. A coordination and rescue center was established in Iceland to search for the Soviet plane. Throughout July and August, NATO aircraft and An-12 from the Soviet Union inspected the area where the crash occurred. In the course of the search, fragments of the fuselage were found, as well as packages of medical supplies and other materials corresponding to the cargo. The search vessels found numerous pieces of styrofoam that protected the rubber fuel tanks. This indicated that the plane had collapsed in mid-air. According to experts' conclusions, the cause of the plane's destruction could have been an explosion on board. Other versions of the crash were also considered, from collision with an aerostat to the fire, but the found wreckage disproved these versions. The investigation did not reveal any remarks or shortcomings in the preparation of the aircraft at the airbase. The search continued for almost a month, but nothing more was found. According to the version of the Commission of the Ministry of Aviation Industry of the USSR, on the flight level there was an explosion of the overpressurized cargo cabin. Similar situations happened in the history of transport aviation, and not only in ours, so this version was considered the most convincing. After air crash over the Atlantic, the flights of AN-22 with inflated cargo cabin were limited. Soviet military, not determining the reasons of the catastrophe, considered that the explosion could be due to sabotage, so the aircraft was attributed to combat losses. This was the end of the committee's work. The cause of AN-22 crash over the Atlantic was never identified. And suddenly, in December of the same year, another AN-22 crashed in India. All the people on board were killed. As in the case of the Atlantic flight crash, the plane which crashed in India was brand new, manufactured in 1969. The plane was returning from Pakistan to the Soviet Union. Upon receiving information about the accident, a group of Soviet specialists flew to the crash site and, with the help of their Indian colleagues, initiated a 20-mile search effort to locate the wreck within a radius of the crash site. The team found the flight recorders. The first flight recorder recorded flight data as well as the position of controls and engine status. But it turned out that the recorder was broken and there was no record of the last flight. This circumstance greatly complicated the investigation. The second flight recorder, recording internal and external conversations of the crew, was found undamaged. But most importantly, 18 miles from Panchnagar, a team of specialists found an important clue for the investigation: the torn-off hub of the twin propellers from the second engine. 3 of the front propeller blades were sticking out of the hub, and the fourth seemed at first to have gone into the ground. All 4 of the rear propeller blades were cut off at the base of the blade and scattered across the field. But when they lifted the propeller hub, they found that the fourth blade was missing. The propellers were taken to the Indian Air Base and, under a magnifying glass, the remainder of the destroyed blade showed pockets of fatigue cracks in the metal. It looked as if these cracks originated from a knife cut as deep as 0.3 of a millimeter. They developed more and more with each flight, leaving dark streaks at the base of the blade. There were 3 such cracks. They merged into one large crack that captured up to 35% of the blade diameter cross-section. Experts from the aviation laboratory proved that when one blade of the front propeller was torn off, an unbalancing moment of up to 50 tons was applied to the shaft gearbox, which caused the blades to shear off. All 4 air blades were equally torn off at the base at an angle of about 45 degrees. Thus, being in India, the experts found out the main cause of the propeller blade breakage and reconstructed the chronology of the tragic accident. After taking off from Dhaka Airport in Pakistan, on a 43-minute flight near the Indian city of Burdwan, at an altitude of 20,500 feet, a blade comes off the front propeller of the second engine. There is a momentary imbalance at the propeller hub, causing the rear propeller blades to shear off and tear the hub from the engine. The shrapnel damages the first engine and fuel lines. All 4 engines fail. The pilots did not know that the second engine had a torn-off bushing of the twin propellers. After the crash over the Atlantic, the AN-22 was flying with a leaky cargo cabin, so the crew could not enter it and inspect the engines through the portholes. With no information on the nature of the breakdown, the flight engineer tried unsuccessfully several times to start the second engine, expending the energy of the spare batteries. After 1 minute and 15 seconds, the orientation indicator and airspeed indicator turn off, radio communication fails. But due to the passengers on board, the captain does not give the order to leave the plane and decides to land the plane in an emergency at the nearest airfield. The Calcutta airfield is about 80 kilometers from the crash site at an angle of 120 degrees to the left. Each aircraft has its own aerodynamic quality. Simply put, this means that the higher the aerodynamic quality, the farther the plane can fly with failed engines. The aerodynamic quality of the AN-22 at 19,700 feet allowed it to fly to Calcutta with its engines failing. In emergency situations, when all engines fail, pilots try to run the inboard engines to reduce torque on the axis and avoid a half-wing roll with a failed engine. After several attempts, the flight engineer still manages to start the third engine, greatly increasing the chances of reaching the nearest airfield. The plane's captain tries to set a course for Calcutta. But soon the flight engineer reports that the engine is not responding to manual control, indicating a break in the control cable. The third engine was operating in standalone mode at only 64% power and was not being controlled. In addition, the third engine's generator could not be connected to the onboard power, causing a rapid loss of power to the emergency batteries. The pressure in the hydraulic system dropped, making it impossible to control the landing gear and wing mechanization. The crew decided to make an emergency landing at the nearest airfield. The captain of the aircraft was an experienced military pilot, who had flown this type of aircraft for many years. The crew saw the runway of Panagar airfield ahead. During descent, a fire occurs on the left wing due to a ruptured fuel line. In a few seconds there was a fire in the third engine, the flight engineer disabled it and the AN-22 started its descent. The landing approach was continued using emergency batteries, which quickly ran out of charge. The speed at this point was about 250 miles per hour, whereas the normal speed should have been 150 to 155, but the pilots were unable to extinguish it in this situation. At 100 miles per hour above normal speed, the AN-22, with the landing gear and flaps retracted and the pressure in the hydraulic system dropped, flew nearly the entire 7,200-foot runway at an altitude of about 1 meter. In the process of leveling the aircraft, a right-side roll occurred, the unguided aircraft hit the ground, completely collapsed, and burned up. All 17 people on board were killed. How the propeller blades ended up stabbed remains a mystery. The commission started to check the production technology of the blades and found out where the cracks were coming from. The flights of all AN-22s were immediately suspended. A thorough inspection of the entire AN-22 fleet revealed similar damage to the propeller blades on 13 aircraft, which had nicks in the beginning of cracks. All of these blades had been manufactured by a single worker at the aircraft factory. To lighten the weight of the propeller, the base of the blade is formed of plastic on the outside. This part is virtually non-functional, not participating in the creation of air thrust. The burrs of this plastic insert must be cut by hand with a special plastic knife, and then cleaned and coated this place with a special compound. There was a physically weak employee at the workplace who violated the technology by cutting the burrs on a plastic insert with a sharp homemade steel knife. The knife left scratches on the surface of the blade base due to excessive force. Further grinding of the blade failed to completely remove the nicks up to 0.3 of a millimeter deep. These scratches became stress concentrators and resulted in fatigue cracks. This gross defect was the result of poorly controlled propeller blade manufacturing techniques. But if the propellers were clear, what caused the failure of all 4 engines is still unknown. The commission took another 10 days to investigate this circumstance. But the cause of the failure of the 4 engines was found after 2 days. After the front propeller blade of the second engine broke off, all 4 blades of the rear propeller were cut off and scattered. All these blades were found. 3 of them were smooth and in good condition. But the 4th blade was deformed and had numerous chips and nicks. The blade was carefully examined and traces of the paint used to paint the aircraft were found on its surface. Remains of fuselage insulation material were also found on the end of the cut blade. It was immediately clear that the severed blade had punctured the hull of the aircraft and cut the wiring and engine control cables, causing all 4 engines to shut down. Fragments of the air blades had damaged the first engine and fuel lines, causing the wing to catch fire. Having figured out the cause of the plane crash in India, the experts went back to the AN-22 crash over the Atlantic. Now there was no doubt that the cause of that plane crash was the same as in India. The other thing was that the inflated plane over the Atlantic exploded because of a hole made by a blade in the fuselage. In the Indian crash, the impact of the blade on the fuselage did not cause the plane to explode because the cabin was not airtight. There is still no unequivocal answer as to whether the ban on sealing the cargo cabin played a fatal role in that flight. If the cargo cabin had been pressurized, the blade that pierced the fuselage probably would have caused a decompression explosion. But entering a depressurized cargo cabin to inspect the engines, the crew could have too. Thus, due to the laziness of one employee and the negligence of quality control, people in 2 aircraft died. Even with one engine's propeller hub coming off, 3 was quite enough for the plane to make a landing at Panagarh Airfield. But in a situation where one engine is running at up to 70% power, and it is also out of control, it is impossible to accurately reach the runway and land. The airplane was flying at an angle to the runway and with a roll. The vertical speed was over 100 feet per second. The actions of the plane's captain Nikolai Skok and the crew members could be safely written into the aviation textbooks. But under the circumstances, the crew had no chance of a safe landing. Not a single mistake was made by the crew on this flight. There are no trifles in aviation. Safety is built up over years and decades. And everything must be strictly adhered to. Unfortunately, the lessons come at too high a cost, taking human lives. During the lifetime of the AN-22, 9 aircraft have died in accidents and disasters. Subscribe and click on the bell so you don't miss the next video.